Tonight's topic is designing impactful mixed methods research. And what I want to do tonight is focus on the idea of design more than anything else. I have other webinars where I talk about the basic principles of mixed methods, how we uh, align qualitative with quantitative inquiry, how we move that around a little bit and how we create something meaningful. But that kind of basics is not what I want to focus on tonight. What I want to focus on tonight is how do we create a mixed methods strategy to help us actually get the data we want. And at the end of the day, the absolute most important thing is us getting the data that we want and designing an approach to research that gives us both qualitative and quantitative perspectives, but gives it to us at a timing or a juncture that is extremely important. And that's what my focus tonight's going to be on. The objectives are to understand key issues, considerations in designing mixed methods study, understand how mixed methods design evolved both within and throughout your study. And this is something that I find. We plan something, we have a certain idea of what we want it to be. And as we progress with both our reading, perhaps even some of the initial data collection, or even partway through, we then discover, oh, I need to adjust the way in which my approach is operationalized. And that's okay. Realizing that how different data intersects isn't going to give you the best results partway through your journey is much better than realizing it right at the end and saying, oh, I should have done it differently. So you can change things. Third objective is explore the contribution that diagramming, implementation matrices, and joint displays bring to communication of your research. So this is not just the execution, but this is how do you communicate it to your audience, i.e. your examiners, people who are going to read your dissertation, probably your parents and a couple of others. Okay, kidding. But, whoever's going to read your research so that they can actually get a visual understanding of how you are approaching it. Appreciate the evolving issues related to integration. And finally, to understand and respond to key issues and challenges related to ethics and mixed methods design. So those are the objectives tonight. I'm also going to share a little bit of research that I'm doing at the moment through a diagram to be able to see how complicated but that creating a mixed methods approach can be, but also how logical that becomes as you progress. The session that I usually do, I have an introductory session on mixed methods research. It's available on our website. Just head into ttt.education/resources and scroll down and you'll see I've got an old introduction to mixed methods. So if you want to get a bit of a background on the different generic types of approaches to mixed methods, then of course that one's going to be really good for you, okay? So something you can go back to, but it's not nearly as deep as what we are doing tonight. To avoid anything of plagiarism, because I borrowed a few slides from others, a couple of resources that I think are really great, and I will put these up tomorrow. I've also got a huge reading list on mixed methods, which I will put through our chat group and of course on our LinkedIn page that give a lot of resources, both textbook-based and journal article-based and application-based within social science disciplines in particular, uh, to help you understand different elements of mixed methods. But these two have helped me in creating the slides for tonight, but also in being relatively up to date with things. So let's just start with a general definition of mixed methods. So mixed methods represents research that involves collecting, analyzing, and interpreting qualitative, quantitative data in a single study or a series of studies that investigate the same underlying phenomenon. Okay, so that's kind of a typical old definition of it as well. If we go to the most famous people for mixed methods, which is John Creswell and Plano Clark, but definitely John Creswell. Mixed methods research is a research design with philosophical assumptions, as well as methods of inquiry. As a methodology, it involves philosophical assumptions that guide the direction of the collection and analysis of data and the mixture of qualitative and quantitative data in a single study or series. Its central premise is that the use of qualitative and quantitative approaches in combination provides a better understanding of the research problems that either approach alone wouldn't. Now that's the key thing. We do mixed methods because it's about the value that the contribution of both qualitative and quantitative bring. We can also do multi-methods. For example, I can do a study that involves 3 or 4 different qualitative methods that helps me. And there's similar principles, but it's not considered mixed. It's considered multi because I'm within the qualitative paradigm. Mixed methods is about breaking down the wall or the barrier between the qualitative and the quantitative worlds and showcasing that they each contribute something valuable to the research experience. So a mixed methods research design is a procedure for collecting, analyzing, and mixing both quantitative and qualitative research and methods in a single study to understand a research problem. But as with all methods, mixed methods has evolved a lot. So if we go back, we're using old definitions here. It has evolved a lot in the last 15 plus years. And I want to look at what mixed methods is really available for these days. So as it's evolved, how has it added? And, a few of the areas that are really strong potential. The first one is wicked problems. And if you haven't heard of this, a wicked problem is something that is considered particularly complex, multifaceted, urgent, stubborn. If you go onto LinkedIn, every day you'll see somebody talking about a wicked problem, and it's really just a bigger, bigger, bigger problem. The great news is with AI as a tool for data analysis, both qualitatively and quantitatively, we can actually work with bigger data sets on both and find a way to bring them together to help solve bigger problems than we had before, which is wicked problems. There are also problems that are at best only resolved over and over again. And that's a really old definition. In fact, that definition is older than I am. But there are a lot of problems. There are a lot of research questions out there that we attempt to resolve, but we don't feel like we're getting anywhere. And when we relabel it as a wicked problem, we also recognize that we have to take new approaches to the methods in order to solve the problems. Mixed methods provides us with fresh ways. Yes, it does. It gives us different contortions, different permutations of how we are going to go about using different research methods to be able to solve them. And the mixed methods in particular has the potential to finding solutions to wicked problems, but it also has the potential to stimulate new kinds of questions, which involves the use of innovation and methodology needed to address the complexity. Now, to me, the concept, innovation and methodology, can be taken two ways. The first way that it can be taken is, look, I'm creating an entirely new methodology in order to be able to resolve a problem. So, for example, I'm working with children. I've realized that these children don't like to speak, but these children spend so much time on their phones. Now, not really new, but a few years ago it was. So instead of doing anything like observational research or anything like that, what I end up by doing is I give them a phone each, and I get them to record an hour of their day. Now, this is an emerging creative technique. It's a qualitative technique. But at the end of the day, it was an innovation to be able to overcome some problems at the time it first became used. Now, that's the first type of innovation and methodology. It's finding new ways to engage. The second one is about finding new ways to connect, and this is where mixed methods comes in. How do we build a program of different methods that intersect or come together, that align to inform each other and help us build a solution or find a solution to an overall problem? So the innovations in methodology can be both creating something new or finding that unique combination of how they come together. We also have the idea of theory generation, and this kind of has a close relationship to wicked problems, but it's about viewing conventional constructs in radically new ways. And this really simply comes down, mixed methods is a way to prompt theory generation. By stepping outside of the paradigms of research that we would normally do, we have a way to create, to write, develop, whatever word you want, new theory. And we can use the mixed methods approach to help us evolve existing theory, or more in a grounded theory approach, take it and start from scratch. Mixed methods is also fantastic for culturally responsive research. And this is something that I particularly enjoy, because we talk about qualitative and quantitative approaches, but that's very much a typical Western paradigm. And we have to be able to look at other approaches, culturally embedded approaches that probably don't fit into a quantitative qualitative divide as we would see it from the textbook. So mixed methods gives us some really nice untapped potential. Look at decolonization, looking at indigenous research methods, and also culturally responsive forms of research. So have a think about, whether this does apply to you or not, or even into the future, right? But mixed methods are giving us a greater power to the research tools that we have, because it's about bringing more data into the equation for us to be able to work with. I want to revisit something, and I do this in my introductory session, okay, and that's why it's called a revisit, a philosophical end or the death of mixed methods. And this is quite an interesting one. A quote from 2007, which I fully believe it, okay? Mixing methods is wrong, not because methods should be kept separate, but because they should not have been divided at the outset. Early research was mixed methods. Then the qualitative school, the quantitative school, and everything that came with it said, you know what? We have to do it a certain way. We have to limit our research. And I think at the end of the day, we're coming full circle because it's not about mixed methods no longer existing. Mixed methods existed at the beginning before we gave labels to qualitative, to quantitative, to indigenous research methods, or to creative research methods. It existed right from the start. So the very nature, the historical nature of research is effectively the mixed methods approach. Now, I put this in here, one, because it's that tie back to the earlier session if you want to watch it, but two, because a lot of people go in, they pick up, say, one of Cresswell's earlier works, you know, we're going back to sort of 2010-ish, and they say mixed methods was created. And it wasn't, because mixed methods has always been there. It just wasn't called that. So it's kind of just a little bit of an awakening for us. Now, this one is really useful. The reference there is something that you can go and find. There's actually a couple of articles that have been published very subsequently for Guterman, looking at this very specifically. I haven't actually gone and got these from my electronic database yet, but I think I'll make an effort to try and find this. But it's a good thing to ask about, are you ready to be a mixed methods researcher? And this is a simple, I want to call it a checklist because it's not really an analysis, okay? But it is a checklist as to whether you are skilled, you have the necessary skills to become a mixed methods researcher. And there are a requirement, I guess, to have a different, deeper set of skills, because it's not only just quantitative versus qualitative, it's the analysis that comes with that. It's the communication that comes with that, the ability to write it up, the ability to understand how the two types of data, the two different worldviews of data can come together. So highly recommend. As I said, I'll do my best. I'll try and pick this up from my university library and share it. But if any of you do manage to get it, do share it in our chat group, so that others can have a read of it as well. But do, if you are looking at a mixed methods approach, do take a look at this. Do go through and do be honest with yourself. Be honest with yourself about the skills you have, because to be a strong, credible researcher, you also have to develop your own skills. And in some cases, you might be here and you might be saying, actually, I don't have these skills. That's okay. But part of your PhD journey is certainly going to have to be, how can I develop? How can I learn some of these? How can I develop? How can I better these skills so that I become more proficient at research? Now, here's a little bit of, it's actually a slide from a presentation by John Cresswell. I got this slide because a few years ago during lockdowns, when we didn't have that much to do, I went to a whole lot of famous people, famous academics presentations, and he spent some time talking about advances, changes in mixed methods. And I like this slide because it's talking about the fact that mixed methods has opened up discussions about the research process. And that's a very important thing to look about. You know, we used to have a more mono-paradigm approach. We were qualitative or we were quantitative. But the questions it opens up is a little bit more different. It's not only, can I use alternative methods to collect data and inform my discussion? It's some of these other questions as well. So for example, when to use theory in a design, how to write mixed methods study aims and questions. Actually, that changes the game, because quantitative is typically your research objectives, your hypothesis, etc. Qualitative is different from that. How to compose the writing of a mixed methods study. Actually, how do we go about the storytelling? What do we use as our written techniques or our writing techniques to help us with that? How do I portray integration in a study? So joint displays, and we're going to talk about that tonight. But actually, how do I showcase how my data comes together and how I, as the researcher, make meaning from my data coming together? How to determine that type of integration, how to describe methodological or validity issues of design. And in fact, you end up by having more to describe in your methodology chapter, because you're using multiple methodologies. And then you're justifying how they feed into each other and in what contortion or what design do they fit into each other. How do I draw a sophisticated diagram of a mixed methods design? And that's a challenge. So later tonight, I've got a few different samples. I've got a couple of samples from some research candidates that I work with. And I've also got a sample that I did the other day, trying to reflect on some research that I'm just starting and how I want to put it together. And I've got to say, drawing, and you'll see it, it's a hand-drawn one. It's not even computerized or digitized yet, right? But you'll see it's a complicated thing to be able to diagramize a set of flows or a set of relationships between different types of data. Then it has questions, how do I choose a type of mixed methods design? And, I want to say, the answer is easy, it's intuition. But at the end of the day, it's us knowing what we want at the end, what data we need to get that, how will that data contribute to other aspects, and then how do I get that data as a researcher? So it's working backwards from the end goal and trying to think, who are all the stakeholders? Who are all the players in my research? And you'll see with the diagram that I've drawn, I've got multiple stakeholders, and I'm actually going to the approach of getting both qualitative and quantitative data from multiple stakeholders, including technology as a stakeholder in that as well. So it's, how do I choose that? I had to think. I've been thinking for ages, how do I structure it out? And the final one that's on this list, okay, how to write a mixed methods title. And that's just the title of your dissertation. What do you put? An integrated approach, a mixed methods approach, qualitative and quantitative reflections on. This has actually made us rethink. Now, choosing our title never was particularly difficult, but I promise you it was never particularly easy either in the first place. So with that, it gives us another challenge. Also, we use our title to signal to our audience, actually, what are we going to try and achieve? And that kind of indicates to me, do I want to read this or do I not want to read this? So let's start off with some issues we have with mixed methods. And we're going to talk about reading and literature reviews, because the early part, before we even write a methods chapter, before we even settle on a mixed methods design, we've got to think about this. So issue number one is many researchers are not reading the literature about mixed methods research design to identify latest developments. That's partly why I put together this 5-page reference list, because it is about looking at what's available over time. It's also looking at what the updates are. Many of us say, okay, mixed methods, Creswell, Plano-Clark, okay, early 2010s to 2015, just grab a book off the shelf and go with it. But what those academics were doing 15 years ago has evolved significantly. Yes, they founded the movement to bring us back to a mixed methods approach, but they didn't have all the answers. And as time has evolved, we see a lot of nuances coming into it, especially in the last few years. We see, additional changes. We see different contortions. We see better ways of strengthening the relationship between the embeddedness of qualitative and quantitative data. So we need to make sure we're keeping up with the latest developments. And that's developments in general, but it's also designs, mixed methods designs that will support your project design. You've got to go into it and say, where is the evidence that suggests that this approach will help what I want to do? Or where is the evidence that suggests this approach can even work? So here's where I have a challenge. One of my stakeholders in my research is technology, artificial intelligence, ChatGPT in principle. ChatGPT is a respondent in my research. Now, not a lot of people have done this, and I'm still trying to grapple with how do I justify it and how do I make sure I sit comfortably or sit safely, within ethical boundaries. My design has an integration between humans, both from a qualitative and quantitative perspective, but it also has an integration with artificial intelligence, with ChatGPT as a respondent. Now, that design, I'm struggling out there, to see anybody who's doing it in the context of where I'm focusing on. There's a few little bits and pieces, but it's my job to make sure that I've looked as hard as I can and found anybody who's tried to do this regardless of the discipline context, so that I can learn about their experience and how that, informed their design, and how, most importantly, how is it going to inform my design? So the first thing, as I said, it's keeping really up to date. It's not falling back on the typical Creswell type work, but it's looking at who's doing this in 2025, not who's theorizing about it, who's actually doing this type of research, and what can I learn from their experiences and probably their mistakes as well. Issue number 2, many researchers are uncertain about how to choose among the different types of literature review to present their decisions for their research design. Now, that one is also a challenge because we have many factors here. Are we looking at bibliometric literature reviews, for example, the bibliometric analyses that kind of tell us the most cited? Well, that's wonderful, but it doesn't cover everything. It also doesn't highlight somebody who's published in an open access journal that's not Scopus or, high ranking or something. But the research and the ideas towards the design of methodology, the emergence of a new approach, is not there. So it's hard for us to figure out how to do that. My advice is really simple. I know a lot of universities say, oh, you've got to always go for journals that are ranked and have certain scores and stuff like this. I want to call bullshit on that. I think you need to read widely. What ends up in your dissertation as something cited, that can fit that game quite comfortably. But you as a researcher have also got to read widely and use your own critical analysis skills to think about, oh, could I use this? Could I think through this? The more we read, the more ideas we get. At the end of the day, you may not be citing everybody, but you are absorbing their understanding of something that has happened and you're trying to evolve your own. So don't limit yourself to certain journals. Don't limit yourself purely to journals within your sub-discipline. Go broader, even go outside of your discipline to really focus on understanding how people have embraced mixed methods. And then with that, you've just got to look at how are you going to frame the approach. And the literature review is simply about, at its most simplest, a chronological structure of how something has evolved. You still, in your chapter 3, your research methodology chapter, that's where you get to advance your own ideas. That's from synthesizing, coming together, thinking together of all the things that you've read. Chapter 2, the literature review, is simply putting there and making an analysis of how that went and whether it's left opportunities. Some issues relate to the concept, and this is the one I hate saying, epistemological assumptions. And this is really how researchers gain knowledge. How do we understand the world? And in particular, as a qualitative researcher, primarily, 100% as a qualitative researcher for me, how do I gain knowledge when I use mixed methods? So what role does any form of quantitative data have in my understanding of the world? And that may differ, for other people, it may be how does my understanding of anything qualitative change the way in which I understand how the world works? But it's about what we consider to be the basis of knowledge and how it is constructed, sorry. Creswell, in his presentation, made a few personal assumptions, which I think are worth exploring. Multiple ways of viewing the world. Absolutely agree. We all view the world differently. We all have different perspectives on how that comes about. There is a dichotomy between qualitative and quantitative, including separate ways of gathering data. I somewhat agree on that, but I was thinking about something this afternoon because I'm designing a massive open learning module on qualitative research for a university at the moment, and I've got 32 different modules going into it, and several hundred hours worth of resources. And amongst all of this qualitative modules, I put survey design, and a few people have said to me, well, surveys are quantitative. Why are you doing that? And I said, because surveys or questionnaires, especially if we go for semi-structured, involve words. They involve different responses. They involve narratives. And although we have this dichotomy between qualitative and quantitative, once in a while, they actually have areas where they intersect because we're using qualitative tools within a quantitative framework. Creswell's personal assumption is there's an equality of qualitative and quantitative research. I somewhat agree, but my context for that is very different to what Cresswell had in mind. I think for many of us, I think for many of us, there is the likelihood that the two are actually there. Okay. Hang on, sorry, I'm having some issues with, there we go. Let's hope that works. My Zoom is playing up. The equality of the two is not about the fact that qualitative research will do as good a job as quantitative research or vice versa. It's about the fact that, generally speaking, both will give us answers that we can generate meaning from. Now, again, it's a challenging one because you might disagree with me, and you'll see my note, at the bottom. We're each different in this. We don't have to agree, but we do have to understand and acknowledge our own assumptions and be transparent about them. And I think that's valuable for us to think about. The fourth personal assumption that Cresswell made was about the practical approach to research. And research has to be very practical in the way we want to go about it. There are other issues. So incorporating worldview, and this is somewhere I'm interested in as well. Again, this is not an area we're necessarily going to agree or disagree on. What I want to challenge you, and what I want, or what I hope that you can get out from tonight's experience, but also your experience of using or embracing mixed methods research, is understanding and acknowledging your own worldview. Okay, now there are some similarities to our previous slide, but this is about understanding ourselves and our own worldview. Worldview is not epistemology. If you ever want to upset or punish students, make them say that word. It's so hard. So worldview is not epistemology. It's related to our belief system on how society operates. And what this comes down to is the personal contexts that we have with our mixed methods research. Now, as you see, this is from thinking in 2016, and I'm sure it's evolved a little bit more over time as well. But early on, there really wasn't that much thought about how do we embrace or engage or understand our worldview within mixed methods. This includes things like, the personal context, includes things like researchers' background knowledge, our theoretical models, our philosophical assumptions, and how our personal context influences mixed methods research projects. And that could be our own experience and what it's contributed for us. What we need to do is identify our own personal context, reflect on how personal experience, values, and training contribute to our research. Now, I'm going to put it in a really simple way. We've been exposed to different forms of research throughout our study life, throughout our schooling, in fact, we've been exposed. How has that shaped the way we've thought about things? What are our preferences? What do we believe works? At the end of the day, it's intuition. It's not what other researchers have said, this is how it will be. It's about us saying, oh, another researcher said this. I don't think they're right. I think they've made a mistake, or I don't think they've assumed things, or assumed certain things. So all it comes down to is reflecting on ourselves for that moment. Again, we're different in this. We don't have to agree, but we have to understand and acknowledge our own worldview and be somewhat transparent about it in the design or in the thinking for the design, but also perhaps in the explanation, the justification for why we have created a particular approach. Now, I'm just going to ask for a 2-minute break. I need to go and get a drink. I'm quite dry tonight, but just give me 2 minutes and then I'll be back to talk about this and to move forward into the design. So just give me a couple of minutes, please. All right, thank you for that. Let's get back into, give me a second. Well, I needed this drink more than I thought. Let's get back into our discussion of issues, because again, these issues are considerations that we have to make as we progress ourselves thinking about mixed methods. So let's talk about thinking across data sets. And this one kind of comes down to how do we find ways that our different data sets can maybe be triangulated, can come together and enhance meaning. Remember, the idea of mixed methods is the two or multiple methods together give us more than what a singular method will give. So we've got to have a good understanding of how each data set is both going to contribute to our knowledge, but is going to support and scaffold or build for itself so that it comes, it contributes and it works together. It's not providing contrary data. It's not providing data that can't be used and described or written up together. We've got to find ways that it really does fit. But we have to do that ethically because we're not, creating, we're not lying, we're not doing anything unethical. But we've got to make sure that our data sets have relationships to each other. So the problem is, what do I do? Do I go about separating my data sets, and how do I think across the data sets? How do I pick and choose from each of them? So Creswell had some comments. Thinking this way, identifying your database as either quantitative or qualitative, listing out the two databases separately, thinking in terms of mining the data deeper through combining the data sets, thinking in terms of how the data sets provide value-added insight or synergy. So, for example, the idea of 1 + 1 = 3. Two data sets alone give us something, but when we've got them together, oh, wow, we've just experienced something else. And this is actually where, for us as researchers, the power of AI is extremely, it's got a lot of potential. I want to say valuable, okay, it's going to be, but there's a lot of potential there. Now, I've added a few of my own thoughts, and my last thought is, might AI help here? And the fact is, I think I've answered that question. I personally believe AI actually can help us a lot in finding new ways to bring together the value of different data sets. Now, for our brains, the natural process is both a separation and an intersection when we think, when we analyze, when we form conclusions in our writing. Now, actually, this is why I personally like working with my data. Okay, I'm not a fan of everything being digitized, computerized, processed through AI. Yes, AI can give us new insights, but for it to give us new insights, that requires us to have insights in the first place. And the only way we get insights is by really working with the data ourselves. So if we've done interviews, it's about really listening over and over and over again until, they just don't shut up in our head, but we're immersing ourselves in that data. And when we start to do that, because that's the intersection, when we start to do that, the ideas develop. But if we're trying to treat them separately, it can also be a problem. So at every stage of our process, our brain cannot lock out something else because it's already part of our thinking. Now, that's mixed methods in the best way. I've understood my qualitative data, but I've also spent a lot of time with my quantitative data. And what I'm doing is, as I'm working very hard on, processing and analyzing my quantitative data and seeing what it does, I'm also, by default, creating those linkages with the qualitative data. And I'm starting to think about what patterns might emerge. Now, AI is going to do that fast for us, but it's got to use what we've got as the basis so that it can springboard even further from there. And that's what we want. But in terms of thinking across the data sets, as researchers, I believe we are always, but we're also trying to follow a model, a pattern. Now, right at the beginning of tonight's session, I made a comment about our mixed methods design, or our approach to the design, will change over time, and that's acceptable. That's okay. This is where it changes, because as we become familiar, we start recognizing that, oh, we're missing something from this. We have to rethink how to get this, or we have to think, oh, this is not going to give us exactly where I thought we're heading. How can I strengthen it? How can I make the process more robust? And of course, we tweak our designs as we are part of the data itself. Sometimes the absolute purpose of mixed methods is as simple as having a pilot study to help us think about the main study. That's a very fundamentally basic mixed methods design. Absolutely fine. But we're using the first method, usually a survey or questionnaire, sometimes just an interview too. But we're using that as a springboard to help shape the next stage. Sometimes we're not. We have to be able to think, how are we going to work with all of this? Because that's what's important for us. Now, there are some thoughts and considerations that we need. One, adaptive and iterative design. So as you're proposing your mixed methods approach, keep in mind that it will change. It will change based on what you learn. It will change based on the technology that is available to help you either collect data or to analyze data. And it will also change as you read more. What you learn comes from data, what you learn comes from literature. And it's going to change the more you read as well. So keep in mind that you are going to have an adaptive design, but also keep in mind that when you're writing, say, a research proposal, that you're acknowledging that the design may adapt or change over time. Keep in mind that when you're writing your final dissertation, that your design may have changed, and transparency showcases what did you learn. So for example, if I'm an examiner at your Viva, one of the things I might ask you, because I'm interested in how you think, I'm interested in how you made decisions as a researcher, as an academic. I'm going to ask you, how did your design change over time and why? What were the key decision points, and how did you think them through? Now, that's not about your research per se, that's about how you solve some problems. But it shows me how have you developed as a researcher? How have you grown as a researcher, which is, of course, the things I really do want to see and do want to understand from you. So put that in, because there is a place for it. You might want to think about integration of advanced data analytics. We can suddenly, because of AI technology and because of the fact that a lot of AI technology is either free or affordable, we can use big data. And that gives us open access to some fantastic secondary data that will help us with our research. So how are we going to, embrace that with our processes? We might have participatory or community-based approaches. This is bringing us, albeit still qualitative, it's bringing us into new areas, emerging areas of qualitative research. We have the use of multiple data sources and how we're going to triangulate that, how we're going to verify each of those, and how we're going to find ways of bringing them together. We might have cross-disciplinary approaches. So, different schools of thought, different worldviews, not from our perspective, but from different discipline perspectives. And how do we bring those together? Earlier I said, look, don't just read your typical John Cresswell textbooks that talk about, how mixed methods happens. Go out and read from different disciplines, from researchers who are innovating at the coalface with mixed methods. Now we've got to understand what lens their specific discipline puts onto their design of mixed methods. We might want to think about collaborations. How are we, even as a PhD candidate, how are we going to use collaborations to help us deepen the data, deepen the access? If two people are doing similar research and there is a possibility to share the data to help both grow the outcomes, that might be something to consider. And the final thought and consideration, at least for this list, how do I go about creating quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method study aims? So on the whole, I want the aims of what I'm trying to achieve with my research. That's your mixed method study aims. What do I get as the end product? But what are the specific qualitative aims? You know, from the qualitative data, what are the aims I'm going to get there? What are the quantitative? Then how do they come together to create meaning for us? Now, mixed methods designs differ in several ways to a typical mono method, singular method. It is about the analytic logic is different. We've got to have the skills to be able to work in both dominant paradigms there, or predominant paradigms, and to be able to see how the data works. So the thinking, you know, a quantitative logic, I guess, is in using our statistical analysis tools to be able to better understand how, what the data is telling us. From a qualitative perspective, say, for example, interviews or focus groups or journaling, I'm getting the narratives and I'm looking at the power of the individual voice. Those are on two completely different planets, but they do work together. Timing is different. You know, not only how long it takes for data collection, but at what point do I require quantitative data to help me shape my qualitative questioning or vice versa, okay? And how long is that going to take? So it's about structuring, scaffolding in a timing for this. There's a priority. You know, we have to think about which one is going to be our priority, or what priorities do we have? Now, let's talk about priorities a different way. It's not about, oh, I should do my qualitative first, my quantitative second, and then I'm going to come back and do a qualitative approach. I want to ask you from a different perspective. When we're doing a mixed method study, we're trying to bring together a very interesting range of ideas. That's perfectly fine. I want to ask you the question of doing research is expensive. If I cannot afford to do this, what data collection process can I remove and what must I keep? That's the priority. Now, I had this discussion with a friend of mine who's just submitted her doctorate. She's actually a collaborator and a friend. She just submitted her document, but about her PhD dissertation, sorry. About a week before submission, she sent to me a question, which I thought was great. In my limitations section, can I say that money was a limit? You know, I couldn't afford to do some of the things that I wanted to do, so therefore I changed my design. Now that's exactly this issue here. If you don't have the resources to do it, how can you still create a meaningful and useful design that will work for you? That's what's important. Point of interface, at which part, you know, where do we interact with our data and how do we do that? And finally, the single study or multiple program of inquiry. And this is really about the scale that you have of your research question as much as anything else related to that. All right, let's move on. I believe in working backwards. So let's identify the goals and objectives. Let's determine the type of data that we want from this. What mixed methods design models are going to enable us to get that particular data? That's important. Then How do I develop data collection and analysis strategies? What are going to be my practical constraints and feasibilities? I can only know my constraints when I understand what will be involved in the collection of data. So, for example, if I don't think about what I need and how much data I'm going to need and how I'm going to go about it, I can't think about, will this cost me money? How much time will be involved in this? Do I have the personal and interpersonal skills available to make it work for me? So this is why I think backwards. I want to look at my end product first, and then I'm coming back to, can I do it as a researcher? Do I have everything that I need, whether it be skills, whether it be manpower, whether it be financial resources? Maybe it's access to the particular population of interest. Only then can I do it. I don't want to start designing something and then say, well, if I add all of this together, what does it make? It's not like Lego. It's not you have a box of Lego and you start putting things and then suddenly it builds something. We have to know what we want and then strategize for it. And that sort of comes to the final, but the first, the pilot testing and feedback. I can design something great, but if my pilot test then tells me all of the assumptions that I have made are wrong, that's a lot of changes, both personally that I have to process, but also changes in my writing that I have to think about as well. So sometimes the very simple pilot test right at the beginning, right at the beginning is actually the most planned thing, because you want to make sure that it's going to work well for us. We have methodological challenges. These are quite easy. Resources, teamwork, page word limitations, sampling issues, analytic and interpretive issues. Nothing particularly difficult or profoundly groundbreaking here to think about. Now I want to talk about evolving a design. And this again was a slide from Cresswell. And I'm harking back in this slide to the very early approaches, the types of design: explanatory, exploratory, convergent. So basically figuring it out, trying to figure it out, or how does it all come together? Let's just put it in the simplest language. Cresswell's early contribution, which I think is the most valuable, is putting together, and I think he did 7, if I remember correctly, 7 typical mixed methods designs. And the designs are about how you collect the data and how the data came together. And they range from incredibly simple to somewhat more embedded and complicated convolutions of that. But as a template, they gave us an approach to think about, how can my data come together? It's not about how will my data come together. It's about, what are the possible different ways I can think about, and what are the tools I need to achieve that in respect of trying to follow that type of design. The mistake that I think many post-grad researchers make is thinking that Cresswell's early design templates are fixed. They're good. Don't get me wrong. They're good and they're a great starting point, but they are not fixed. You've got to look and say, you know what? The relationships here are useful. Now, how do I apply that to my research goals and objectives, to the data types that I want? And ultimately, how do I create a mixed methods design that will work for me? So this is where diagramming comes into it. And diagramming is a way of visually portraying your design. And it's either using a diagram or an implementation matrix. So I'm going to start with diagramming first, because it's really a visual picture of the mixed methods project. It could be a procedural diagram of the core mixed methods designs, or it could be a procedural diagram of how we scaffold those mixed methods. How do they work into each other? So that kind of brings in a temporal or a time-based element to it. Either way, it's a roadmap for you. And I think this is a very valuable roadmap to be able to have. Now, here's a simple example. At the same time I'm going to, I've got a pre-test, I'm using quantitative data, I have a post-test, I'm going to use quantitative data. At the same time, I'm analyzing that data. And it sort of progresses. We collect our data first, we analyze it, then we do some more data collection, and we do some more analysis, then we bring it all together, and then we interpret it. That's the whole process. Now, I'm going to cut out the final circle, okay? The circle on the right, the interpret. At that moment, let's cut that out. This tells me I'm collecting data. I'm collecting some more data, and then I'm going to bring the two data sets together and do some work. Okay, that can work. That might work for you. That's not going to work for everybody. But it gives you an understanding of how the different data that you collect is related to itself, and it's related to its final conclusions. This one is actually also from I cannot say that surname, Ivanokova. Yikes. Okay, some words are hard, okay. Creswell and Stick from 2006, and this was the description of their early sequential exploratory explanatory design. And it was just looking at the different steps and how what they were getting from each one. Again, this is a roadmap. I know I'm going to do it a certain way. I know that I'm going to bring data together, and that's going to inform me in the next stage, and so forth and so forth. This is a set of steps. What a diagram like this or like this gives us is just a set of processes and a set of relationships, but it's also like a checklist, making sure that you've got everything. Now, this one is actually a little bit different, and this is from a friend of mine, someone I work with, which Savia de Souza. She's doing education research on improving resourcing within science education. And she's broken hers down into multiple phases. She and I actually worked on this 2 years ago. It took several months, but over time, she's evolved it and perfected it. And what you'll see is she starts with a survey, but she's broken it, each phase is broken into students and teachers. So students, she's doing a survey. The teachers, she's actually doing focus groups with. So we're collecting quantitative data, qualitative data at the start in order to be able to shape phase 2. And that 2 sets of data comes together. Why one quantitative and one qualitative? Because if she's studying students, she's studying classes, there's 30 to 50 more students than there is for each teacher. So studying a few classes, yes, I can do a focus group with teachers because the numbers are low. But for students, maybe I've got 250 students that I need to work with. Okay, I got to, the population size has got to determine what is the most efficient and effective and reasonable way for me to get the data as we progress. Now, this one's mine. And I apologize, it's never going to be digitized until I publish something, okay? I'm interested in how doctoral candidates can use AI supervision tools. So this is a new area, as we obviously all know. And I decided to do a research project that is supervised by AI, most likely ChatGPT. I'm still seeing where I get my sponsorship, okay? Um, but what I looked at is I wanted to start with a pilot, and I've got to both interview, or I've got to address research candidates and supervisors. So my pilot will be a simple questionnaire because I just want to get some basic frameworks of understanding before I move in. Then I want to interview supervisors. I want to interview research candidates, and I want to interview AI as well. Now, I decided to do this as a second doctorate because I want it to be something different. I want to understand the experience from a personal perspective as well as from the outsider perspective. So I'm using an autoethnography, ethnographic approach, where it's embedded in my own experience. Now, I'm lucky, I've done a PhD, so I understand what it's like to be a candidate. I understand what it's like to be a supervisor, and I can put a critical lens from both perspectives. I want to interview AI. Why? Because AI is forever evolving as well. And if it's to be used as a tool, I want to see what it thinks it's going to contribute and how and why. And then I want to judge whether that's going to work. Now, within all of these interviews, at least for supervisors and research candidates, I've also got many check-in questionnaires, and they kind of relate back to my pilot. I want to see, is there a pattern of change of thinking from the initial assumption? And each time I have that pattern of change, that becomes a question for me to ask in the interview. But I want to focus the interview based on whether that is the case. And then I've got to be able to say from my own experience, how do I view it? Now, as I said, it's kind of complicated, but this is a roadmap for me. This roadmap has taken me 3 months to think about and to finally get on paper. Up here, I know what I want. Putting it onto paper, the visualization of it took a longer time. And about a year's time, it will be nicely digitized. Now, we can move from this kind of approach to a more implementation matrix. Now, this kind of has some parallels with what Sabi is doing. Okay, this is both, a diagram of what we're doing, but it's also a bit of an implementation matrix. So it kind of fits in. I'm going to say, focus on mapping out what you think you want, then decide later how you want to present it, in what format are you using. This one looks at it in respect of phases and then activities. So phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. What are the key activities? At what point do certain things happen? At what point does data intersect with other data so that I can create, or I can analyze, sorry, and then start to write up my findings. Another approach is, and this is something that's very, very useful from the dissertation perspective, especially when it comes to defense in NVIVA. A joint display provides a visual means to represent the integration of qualitative and quantitative research. So at what point do they come together? In addition to providing a framework for thinking about it, the framework breaks down the cognitive process of merging, comparing, relating, and linking data. So it's not like here or here or here, where I'm looking at what are my steps. what I'm looking at here is showcasing how the different data sets work together from an analysis perspective and how I'm using them together. And, there are 5 major types of joint displays. And for this, I'm not going to go into too much detail because, I could do another couple of hours on this. But I encourage you, go check out Guterman et al. 2021. And I think, just let me check, I'm pretty sure it's in here. Yes, it should be. It should be in my references. Go check it out because it gives a lot more detail, but it talks about the types of joint displays, when and how you're going to use them. It's another tool after we've made the design. It's another tool to help us understand how we're going to make use of the different data sets that we've got and how we're going to bring them together and make sense. And again, coming back to the very early thing I said, mixed methods is about the exponential power of multiple data sets and how that contributes. That's really what the concept of a joint display is about, helping you to communicate in your dissertation so that the readers, the examiners, your supervisor understands where you went and how it comes together. It's also about transparency. It's about transparency of how the different data sets were used and how you got that growth or those extra insights that you would not have got if you only had a single data set or a single qualitative or quantitative approach only. Now, we need to be very specific about how we set up integration as well. And integration is about how we bring together the two types of data. And there's a few different ways. We either merge the data sets, we connect the data sets, or we embed them. Now, my own approach, going back to my ugly diagram here, my own approach is certainly more embedded of what we're trying to do. But the advances, what we've got to think about in the last, in the previous 5 years, is knowing about the different integration types, the connecting, the building, the merging, the embedding, and how they may work for us. Now, that's some reading you've got to do, but that's not reading about the theory. That's going into other researchers who have done things similar to you and really understanding, how did they make it work? How did they make it work for them in their research context, and learning from that perspective? The theory of it's irrelevant. What you need to showcase is learning from any previous researchers' actual mistakes, or learning from the great things they managed to achieve and how that provided benefits for us. About locating the integration in our designs. So as we go through and we're building simple diagrams like these or an implementation matrix, it's about at what point or points, because if we go to mine, for example, there are multiple points where my data is definitely coming together to shape, and it's also constantly in the mind. How does that, how does each bit influence each other? And that comes down to, how do I write this up? Because if I do interviews, I design an interview, I conduct all of my interviews, and then I write it up. But if these are pepper potted throughout other approaches, how do I write up and say, how does part one influence part two, snowball into part 3 and give us something else in part 4. So it's about that growth, and that becomes the written communication, approaches that we have to think about. All right, some ethics considerations before we wrap up and go to Q&A. As it always, participants must participate voluntarily. Participants must understand purposes and procedures of the study. Now, it's a bit more complex, so you also need to show to participants early on how they are part of the bigger picture, even though they may only be involved in a small part of it. Participants must understand that they have a right to a copy of the results. That's quite an interesting one, because if we're just doing, say, surveys or interviews, it's an easier thing to do. Now we've got to decide, how do we make sure that they get access to the outcomes and what's going to work in a way that will understand for them? Potential benefits of the study. Researchers have to understand the impact of their presence at research sites and ensure that these are left undisturbed. Okay, that kind of sounds like we're going into a construction site and we're going to do something. But the truth is, we're still going into the lives of other people in some format. And we've got to make sure that our approach is not going to cause issues or problems for them. Care has to be taken to identify and to nullify any actual or perceived issues where the power between the researcher and the participant could be abused. Now, in a mixed method study, you've kind of got a little bit more potential to exploit a different power dynamic between, say, the researcher and the researched. So we've still got to make sure that at every single step of our research design, that we're actually not we're not overstepping any ethical boundaries. Anonymity must be maintained during data analysis, kept for a reasonable period of time. Now, here's the thing. If I'm doing, say, a pilot study and then interviews, I may want to interview select people from my pilot study. So although the anonymity is in the final product, i.e. our dissertation, we're actually collecting data on the identification of individuals in the pilot study first, so that we can then map that out and make sure, oh, I want to come back and talk to Fred because his answers are interesting, that, they have multiple steps within that. We need to obviously make sure that writing is free of bias towards any group. I think that's an ethical issue across the board. The details of the study must be carefully explained within the actual report so as to allow readers the opportunity to judge the ethical quality of the study for themselves. Actually, I'm going to add a different thing. This is transparency. This is about me doing this study, producing a 300-page manuscript, and you reading it and finding enough that you can go and do exactly a repetition of that study. So the whole idea of replication, i.e. being able to replicate the study in the mixed methods design. Now, all that simply comes down to is having very strong communication skills that enable you to grow. There's a few more, sorry, just give me a moment. Oops. There's a few more ethics concerns that we have to look at, and we've got to address the following 3 things. How research designs should adhere to ethical standards. Now, that's an expectation, but it's making sure that there are no shortcuts anywhere along the way. How do the designs and the ethics requirements scaffold into each other? If I do a pilot study, a questionnaire pilot study, and then I do some interviews, that's Purely a very simple design. I have to get ethics approval on my questionnaire. I've got to get ethics approval on my interviews, but I've also got to be able to show how does the questionnaire shape my interviews, which might mean that any ethics approval I got on my interviews may need to be updated. So I've got to design it and I've got to showcase it, especially in my proposal. I've got to showcase it in such a way that the relationship between the two activities is strong. I've got to write it in such a way that showcases that both, including any evolution, any evolvement, is that a word? Any evolution of how I went about things was sound ethically as well. And I've got to say, how might the changing or the evolving scaffolding affect changes within or with our ethics approach? So, for example, as I said earlier, keep a flexibility there. But if we're changing things, what does that mean from an ethics perspective? Have I inadvertently found a way that I might be highlighting a respondent in a way that they could be identified? Or have I perhaps created an opportunity where I might have to do something differently? But of course, in order to do something differently, I'm going to need a separate ethics approval for that as well. And if I did, in the final write-up, how do I just write that up? You know, additional ethics approvals were made in relation to change 2. That's fine, but it's about making sure not only are we adhering to the ethics, that we are also being transparent about how ethics changed over time with us.